Professor Chomsky, qual é o balanço que o senhor faz do governo Obama até aqui e nesses últimos 2 anos finais do seu mandato?
International affairs, Obama's major step, contribution, if you like, was to launch the most extensive global terrorism campaign that the world has yet seen. This is the Iran assassination campaign, which officially is aimed at killing people who the administration believes might someday intend to harm the United States and killing anyone else who happens to be nearby. There's been really nothing like that in the past. I mean, this is quite an innovation in the history of international terrorism. It is also a terrorism-generating campaign. That's well understood by people in high places. When you murder somebody in a Yemeni village and maybe a couple of other people are standing there, the chances are pretty high that others will want to take revenge. And that dynamic has been carried out quite effectively. If you look at the history of what the West calls terrorism, jihadi-style terrorism, 15 years ago it was localized in a small corner of northwest Pakistan and Afghanistan, tribal areas. Now it's all over the world. Every part of the world practically has some major so-called terrorist campaigns going on. And it's a natural development. That's what you expect from assassinating people in the tribal areas, which are already pressed very hard by central government policies. Otherwise, in international affairs, there's nothing much to talk about. We continue to support on Israel-Palestine, another major Obama commitment. He continued to support the Israeli policies of illegal settlement and development in the occupied territories, the repeated vicious attacks against Gaza. He went so far as to veto a Security Council resolution calling for implementation of what is official U.S. policy, namely expansion of the settlements, which is a minor issue. It's settlements, not expansion of them. It's an issue. But Obama vetoed that. And in Europe, I think he continued a policy that goes back to 1990 and is extremely ominous. With the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an unofficial arrangement made, verbal, not on paper, between the American government, that was George H.W. Bush first, and Gorbachev. Gorbachev permitted a united Germany to join NATO, a possible military alliance, but the condition was that NATO would not expand. The phrase was 1 inch to the east, meaning East Germany. NATO immediately expanded to East Germany. When Gorbachev complained, he was informed that it was only a verbal agreement. Of course, Clinton then expanded NATO further to Russia's borders in most areas. The mission of NATO was changed from allegedly defending Europe from Russian attack to becoming an international force dedicated to protecting the entire global energy system, meaning pipelines, sea lanes, and also a U.S.-led NATO military intervention force. Obama's expanded this. There are now threats to extend NATO as far as Ukraine, which is right into the heartland of Russian strategic concerns. The current Ukraine government, the post-coup government, has voted overwhelmingly to join NATO. That would be a serious threat to any Russian Russian leader. These steps they carry quite dangerous implications, pressing whatever you think about Russia's behavior, pressing a heavily armed nuclear state to the limits that it's unlikely to be able to tolerate is a threat to continued human existence. There is a perfectly feasible solution to declare that Ukraine would declare explicitly that Ukraine would not join any military alliance and to move towards some settlement about partial autonomy. But that's not being pressed. There are other cases we can review. On the domestic front, Obama's major commitment was to reform the scandalous U.S. healthcare system, which really is an international scandal. Healthcare costs in the United States are about twice the level of comparable countries per capita, twice as high per capita as, say, European states, with not very good outcomes, relatively poor outcomes. The fundamental reason is it's basically privatized. Lots of insurance companies, extensive bureaucracy, bookkeeping, all kinds of complications that come through a privatized system. The parts of the system that are nationalized, like Medicare, which for the aged, that works pretty well, even though it's costly because it works through the private system. Obama, they call it a signature accomplishment, was to pass a reform. It was a reform which was pretty beneficial to the insurance companies who were willing to tolerate it, and particularly to the drug companies. The U.S. has legislation, possibly unique, which bars the government from negotiating drug prices. So drug prices are very high, of course. That was retained by Obama over very extensive popular objection. The new proposals, the Affordable Care Act, is an improvement over what existed. It is registering for health care tens of millions of people who had no health care at all before. It's preventing the insurance companies from carrying out some of the most odious practices, like refusing insurance coverage to people who have some potential health disabilities. So that's typically barred now. There was a popular majority that was in favor of allowing what's called a public option. That means permitting a choice to enter into a national health care system like Medicare, the system for the aged. Obama dropped that without even consideration. Overall, it was an improvement, but nothing like what should have been done or could have been done if the president had appealed and tried to mobilize the public support that existed instead of working through this intricate, arcane, complex private system, which is highly inefficient. Obama came into office right after a major recession caused by the bursting of a bubble in the housing market, which led to a financial crisis. His policies did prevent the financial system from collapse. The legislation that he was implementing called for rescuing the banks, the perpetrators of the crisis, but also providing aid to the victims, people who lost their homes. But only half of that was implemented, the saving of the banks and the insurance companies. The victims were left cold. These were the two major issues in the first two years. Those are the 2 years when Obama had congressional support. The last 2 years, he lost a lot of his support because of disillusionment with the failure, the unwillingness to implement policies for which he'd been elected. The 2010 congressional elections, he lost control of the House and much of the Senate. And after that, he's been facing the extraordinary obstructionism of the Republican Party, which is not a traditional parliamentary party anymore. There's an accurate description of it by one of the leading, most respected conservative commentators, Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, right-wing think tank, who describes the current Republican Party as a radical insurgency which has abandoned any thought of parliamentary action. The way this developed and the reasons are interesting. I think there's no time to go into them, but the outcome is that both houses of Congress are in the hands of a radical insurgency. We saw the nature of their behavior just a few days ago when almost half the senators quickly, without even preparation, signed a letter sent to the government of Iran, essentially warning them not to enter into an agreement that the president is planning to undertake. The nature of that agreement one could discuss, but this is an unprecedented action by a parliament to try to undercut an executive agreement. And their basic policy is try to block anything the government might do in order that they can gain power and pursue their dedication to extreme wealth and corporate power. And in that context, Obama's not been able to do much, not that he really intended to do much.
Como o senhor vê a situação atual da América Latina?
Well, I think what's happened in Latin America in the past roughly 15 years is actually quite spectacular. It's important to remember that, as you all know, that for 500 years, Latin America has been under the domination of Western imperial powers. In the recent period, the United States. Internally, a typical Latin American state has been governed by a very small elite, mostly white, Europeanized, of extreme wealth in the midst of a huge mass of poverty and suffering. Latin America has some of the worst inequality and suffering in the world. This is potentially a very rich continent. Lots of resources, no security problems. With appropriate or internal arrangements, it could be quite prosperous, dynamic, and successful. It hasn't been for these reasons. The elites have been acting as if they have no responsibility for the country. So capital is exported, residences are abroad, imports are mostly luxury goods. That's been the traditional pattern. Taxes aren't paid, corruption's very high, and so on. The countries have also failed to move towards integration. They've been very separated from one another. Lots of these problems have been addressed in the past 15 years. Latin America, the progressive governments took the lead in combating the global neoliberal assault, which has been quite harmful in the Western countries, and particularly in the so-called South, the countries, the weaker, poorer countries. And Latin America has taken the international lead, others are now following, in combating this. There have been steps towards integration, which are quite significant. They are much more limited than they should be, but they're striking. UNASUR, Mercosur, particularly interesting one is CELAC, founded in Venezuela, which strikingly includes every country of the Western Hemisphere except for the United States and Canada. That would have been absolutely unthinkable not many years before, and it's a sign of the freeing of Latin America from the grip of foreign imperialism, and some of the internal problems are being addressed in ways that are limited but not insignificant.